Anyways, today I want to go back to basics, focusing on things like the problems of power, what people do with power, which is not good. And then what most people do to limit power actually shows that they still trust government, even though they shouldn't in any situation. And then a little bit about what should be done instead. I'm going to highlight a lot of the views of leading founders and old revolutionaries, but I've even got a little from modern writers, more modern writers, like people like Harry Browne and Murray Rothbard. And speaking of Brown, let's kick it off with this quick take from his great book, Why Government Doesn't Work, back in the 90s. This was really influential on my thinking, got me rolling a little bit. I didn't read it back then, but here's how Harry put it. You can't give government the power to force good on the country without also giving it the power to force enormous evils on the country. I saw someone reply to a post that we put up today talking about how whatever power you give them to do something that you like, just imagine the absolute worst person you can even dream of having that same power and what they might do with it. Because that's who's probably going to have that power eventually. And I think Harry's point is incredibly important. It's incredibly timeless, especially as we live under the largest government in history. If you rely on the monster state to protect you, well, in essence, from itself, to keep you free, despite the fact that it's filled to the brim with absolute monsters, you're going to be really, really, really disappointed in the long run, even if you're not disappointed in the short run. Now, John Jay had a very similar take here that Harry did. This is all the way back in 1788. The first Chief Justice wrote that, remember that a power to do good always involves a power to do harm. Now, Harry Browne referred to this as the dictator syndrome. And this was, I think, chapter 5, If You Were King, or the Dictator Syndrome. Harry writes, government grows also because well-meaning people like you and me believe it should do certain things that seem beyond controversy, at least to the average person, at least. Find a cure for cancer, stop air pollution, keep violence off television, hold back an aggressor in the Middle East. And this is timeless stuff. Something that everyone seems to agree should be done. But should it be done by government? That's my question. And Harry says, I call this the dictator syndrome. You see suffering or danger, and in your imagination, you see a government program eliminating that danger. But in the real world, the program would operate as you expect only if you were an absolute dictator, having at your disposal all the government's power to compel everyone to do things your way. And you are never the one who gets in charge, because if you want to do good things, well, you don't really want to be in government. You don't want to be the person who wields all kinds of power that it shouldn't have. The largest government, the largest empire in history. We don't want to be a part of that. And the people who end up with the power are really not the good guys. I mean, even if they sound good in the short run. And now here's Oliver Ellsworth, third Chief Justice. A power of doing good always implies a power to do evil if the person or party be disposed. Now, ultimately, this all gets down to trust. Federalists like Jay and Ellsworth and many others, they basically were trying to craft a system where you could trust the system. Trust that it would draw only the good people to positions of power, and that the people wouldn't have to resort to much, we'll say, stronger things to keep government in check. Now, anti-federalists, and some of the federalists as well, anti-federalists primarily, on the other hand, continually warned about having to trust people with power to do the right thing. Here, for example, old Abraham White in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention, one of my favorite anti-federalist quotes, which is, I wouldn't trust a flock of Moseses. Or Patrick Henry down in the Virginia Ratifying Convention said, if you have a good president, senators, and representatives, there is no danger. But can this be expected from human nature? And Patrick Henry, like so many others, they understood human nature. We're flawed creatures. And when we are in positions where we can do bad things, humans often do really, really bad things. And human nature tells us that when people have power, power always grows. Not just sometimes, not just over there, not just in places where, maybe we can protect them with our own power, but all the time. Power always grows. You know, the old saying, power corrupts. Abigail Adams may have summed it up best. Power, whether vested in many or a few, is ever grasping. And like the grave cries, give, give. Power, whether vested in many or a few, is ever grasping, and like the grave cries, give, give. Abigail Adams absolutely nailed it. Or maybe this one might be my favorite pun of all time. Samuel Adams put it this way in a letter to James Warren in 1780. Power is intoxicating, and men legally vested with it too often discover a disposition to make an ill use of it and an unwillingness to part with it. That's power grows, power expands, power corrupts, all in one. And it's this kind of recognition of power and human nature that drove Patrick Henry most likely to point out that government is no more than a choice among evils. It has been a standing maxim for ages. Let me get that context right. He said that government is no more than a choice among evils, has been a standing maxim for ages. So at best, people like Patrick Henry, you have evil A versus evil B. You're still getting evil one way or the other. Now, I'm going to have all this linked to in the show notes. Well, Alan Mosley organizes all the blog posts for these. Hopefully I told him that we're back on schedule today, but I think he probably is aware of that. But he's been organizing all the blog posts for these for the last few weeks. I really appreciate the great work that he's been doing. He's been helping me put together some articles from previous episodes as well, because some people like reading. We can't, it's a lot of time and energy to do this, but we're investing in that as well so we can share the content more widely. So very grateful for Alan and his work, along with Mike Meharry, TJ Martinell, and so many others who have been supporting us. But we'll get the blog post over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And for every single episode, you'll find at the top, there's a quick overview. Then you have the audio and the video player. And then there's a show links section. So you can say, hey, Bolden, where's that speech that Patrick Henry gave on June 7, 1788? Will be linked to there so you can read and learn more in context on your own time. There'll also be a link to Harry Brown's full book as a PDF. I'm not sure how long that link is going to be active, but it is working this morning, so we'll put that up there as well. If not, you'll be able to find why government doesn't work in other places. And while I'm here, I want to say a quick hello to everyone out in the live chat. Again, I hope you guys had a really nice Thanksgiving, and I really appreciate you kicking off your week with me. There is, let me see here, Howard Clegg, Senator DT, Dixie Strong, Cheriton Farmer, Melody, Clay Kent, Haji, Devil Dog, Richard Trowbridge, Rick in Michigan, King Nobody, Kirk Morrison, Lawrence Smith. Man, I'm scrolling through as quickly as I can to get back to this. I appreciate you guys all being here, and I will look in the comments a little bit later in the episode or later today and tomorrow. I get a lot of great ideas for future episodes. And of course, things like leaving reviews on Apple Podcasts, smashing the like button, comments, especially in the archive. All these things can help trigger the algorithms of the mainstream platforms and tell them to show us to more people. So I really appreciate you being really engaged in the show as well. Because, I mean, trying to come up with ideas every few days is not always the easiest thing. So your comments and questions are really awesome on that end of things. But let's get right back to it. So instead of trusting people with power, so we shouldn't be trusting anyone with power, right? But instead of trusting no one with power, and that includes the people who tell you trust no one with power. So John Adams, I think, is a great example of this. He says, trust no man with the power to endanger the public liberty. And John Adams, when he had power, well, you couldn't trust him because he endangered the public liberty with the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. That doesn't mean everything else he did was terrible. It's certainly, even Jefferson would have been the same type of thing, but then he was bad with the embargoes from 1807 and beyond. And he even recognized that he went beyond the Constitution in his own view. He was willing to go beyond the Constitution for the Louisiana Purchase, something that he had said some years earlier. He said, to take a single step beyond the limits of the Constitution is to give them a boundless field of power. So one step beyond the limits of what they're authorized to do, even if you like the short-term results, this sets the precedent for other people to go beyond the limits. And like I was saying from that person over on Twitter or on X this morning, they said, think about it as if the worst person in the world is going to have the power to do the type of stuff that you want someone you like to do today. And those are the people who have that power. So John Adams is a great example of trust no one with power, because when he was out of power, he was saying trust no one with power. And when he got in power, well, you know what he did. So, but most people today, instead of trusting no one with power, they totally trust their team with power. They trust their side of the equation, red or blue. And you can tell by their actions. And it's not just, even if they're complaining about their team all the time, which we hear quite often on both major sides, They still, by their actions speak louder than words. Their actions tell us that ultimately they trust their team maybe to be less bad or less evil, but they still trust them. They do three main things to respond to federal power. One, they vote the bums out in the hopes that the new bums, if you can even get new bums in there, are going to look at all that power handed them on a silver platter and say, oh, no, thanks, I'm not going to use this. Or they'll march on Washington, D.C. and demand that the people in office, the current bums, stop doing what they weren't supposed to be doing in the first place. Or they're going to go to federal court in the hopes that the government judges are going to limit government power. But these are not the actions of a free people. Going to the federal government and asking the federal government to stop doing what the federal government wasn't even supposed to be doing in the first place is not a people living in the land of the free. These are not the actions of a free people. It's really the actions of a population on its knees begging for permission. Let's go to Murray Rothbard over at Mises.org. Nations by Consent, which will be linked to in the show notes. So he points out that in the U.S., first of all, instead of actually trusting one side with power, trusting someone to get in power in the largest government in history and somehow magically do something it never does, which is protect us from itself, we need to focus on a radical decentralization of pretty much everything. And that's how Murray Rothbard put it in Nations by Consent. He said, in the U.S., it becomes important in moving towards such radical decentralization for libertarians and classical liberals, indeed for many other minority or dissident groups, to begin to lay the greatest stress on the forgotten 10th Amendment. And laying stress on the forgotten 10th Amendment. Now, we don't forget it, but we're trying to remind other people about the 10th Amendment. But placing a stress on the 10th Amendment isn't about waving a document at government in the hopes that it will convince the government to stop doing what government was never supposed to do in the first place. It's going to look at that piece of paper and say, oh, well, I'm glad you showed me this because we forgot about that 10th Amendment. And now suddenly we realize that all this stuff that we've been doing for the last couple hundred years has been wrong, and we weren't supposed to do it, so we're going to stop it. Because as James Madison pointed out in Federalist number 48, a mere parchment barrier. This was him arguing in support of ratification, and he referred to constitutions. He was talking about how many people were relying on constitutions, words on paper on the state level to protect their liberty. He said, this has been failed. This is a failure. And he said a mere parchment barrier is not going to do the job to stop a tyrannical concentration of power in the same hands. Something else is needed. And I did cover this in a number of episodes. The one that I want to mention today is, did the Constitution fail? Because a lot of people like to point to the words on the paper as if words on paper can stop people with power and people with guns from, well, throwing you in a cage or shooting people because they want to exercise that power. That will be linked to in the show notes as well. Again, exercising or paying attention, exercising the powers under the 10th Amendment, paying attention, putting a great stress on the 10th Amendment isn't just about talking about it. It's about doing things. John Hancock put it this way in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention. He said, the powers reserved by the people render them secure. And again, it's not just because they're telling government, hey, you're not authorized to do this, and all that stuff that we didn't delegate to you, well, you just can't do it, and then they're just going to stop. That's not how it works. Here's how James Iredell put it in the North Carolina Ratifying Convention. He was one of the first associate justices of the Supreme Court. He was a leading Federalist he was on the big government side of things, but he wasn't necessarily a Gouverneur Morris or Alexander Hamilton. He wasn't one of those guys who was like an ultra-high nationalist at the time. But he was in favor of more energetic government. Even Jefferson was certainly over the Articles of Confederation. John Hancock, pretty much most of them really were. Even many of the anti-federalists who opposed ratification, it's not that they loved the Articles of Confederation. Many of them just wanted to see amendments to it. They didn't want to see more indefinite powers, things like the General Welfare Clause, things that could be twisted over time. So anyways, James Iredell put it this way. The only resource against usurpation is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise. And if you unpack that, there's so much that has to be, there's so much that you could unpack in this single statement. First of all, usurpation of power is an exercise of power not delegated to the government. As St. George Tucker put it, this is treason against the sovereignty or final authority of the people. So the only thing that can be done to deal with a usurpation of power, not just a good idea, not something to try later, but the only resource is the inherent or natural right of the people to prevent its exercise. That's not the natural right of the people to ask or demand that government stop doing what government wasn't supposed to do in the first place. This is the inherent right of the people to prevent its exercise. So ultimately, if you want to stop government, here's how Iredell followed up. He said, the people will resist if the government usurp powers not delegated to it. Now, he was certainly trusting that the people were aware of what the government was authorized to do under the Constitution. I hate using that term, government-run education has never taught any of us in generations how to limit the power of government, and we shouldn't be surprised at that either. That is one of the, if not the biggest problem with the government-run education system. Government-run schools teach us that government is the solution to all of our problems, in essence. And even if some of us got better educations, especially early on than I did, mine was absolutely terrible. And in many ways, maybe that was good for me because I just didn't get anything. I was, as a curious and interested individual, I just started looking for more. I've always been looking for more. But if people don't even understand what government is going to do, what is authorized to do, then, well, they're not going to know that they should be resisting it. So this is a different statement. But if people love liberty, that's how you deal with it. You have to resist when government steals power that was never authorized to it in the Constitution. So if you want to stop government and advance liberty, which really is the same thing, one and the same, you have to resist them. Here's how James Otis Jr. put it all the way back in 1762. So long as people will submit to arbitrary measures, so long will they find masters. Arbitrary power is power without right. It is the same as a usurpation. It's power that's not authorized to people in government. It is listed as one of what we call the grievances. They're really injuries and usurpations in the Declaration of Independence. Arbitrary power is one of the reasons, if not the main reason, why they separated and fought a long, bloody war to be free from the British Empire. So the idea that they would just have arbitrary power again is absolutely absurd. It's very sad that we, the people, for generations, have allowed things to degenerate where things have gone today. That is the largest government in history that keeps growing no matter who gets in office. It keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So as long as people continue to comply with arbitrary powers, this establishes what John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution, wrote a few years later after Otis. In 1767, he wrote, this was in 1765 in response to the Stamp Act. He said it establishes the detestable precedent. And in fact, in 1767, against the Townshend Acts, Dickinson said he was more concerned about small usurpations. Big ones, he's like, okay, if you got a really nasty one, people are going to be up in arms about this. But the little ones are really the most dangerous ones, because those are the ones that people really don't want to put their neck on the line for. But every time you do that, it establishes a precedent. And if we understand the maxims of human nature and of government, that government always grows, and people with power will always try to expand their power, always, in one area or another. And if you put that all together, the small ones to Dickinson were the most dangerous, because those are the ones that build and become really part of the system over time. You see how people talk about welfare programs, even the Affordable Care Act. There are so many people who were opposed to the Affordable Care Act, and now that part of it is gone, everyone seems to be just like, it's status quo now. It's just part of the system, even though the regulatory system is destroying our ability to have good health care. Anyways, that's a side note. So as long as people continue to submit to stuff that government isn't supposed to do, government will never stop adding to that mountain of laws, rules, regulations, and orders that shouldn't exist. My favorite might actually be from Walt Whitman's Caution. This is a poem, I think it was first published in 1860. And here's how Walt Whitman put it. To the states, or any one of them, or any city of the states, resist much, obey little. Once unquestioning obedience, once fully enslaved. Once fully enslaved, no nation, state, city of this earth ever afterward resumes its liberty. Well, I hope you guys found this interesting. I hope it was educational, more important than anything. I hope you learned something. There is absolutely nothing that helps us get this kind of information out to more and more people every single day, more than the financial faith and support of our members. We've had a bunch of people join us recently, especially through Thanksgiving weekend. I'm so grateful for your support. Our memberships start out at just $2 a month. As they keep devaluing that dirty government fiat, throw some of it our way. We punch above our weight class like no other. Over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Again, $2 a month is where it starts. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. I see a bunch of people out there. I'm not doxing anybody today, or hopefully ever. I see a bunch of people who have joined us as members. I'm very grateful for your support, and I also want to thank just a handful of people who have joined us lately. There's Betty in Florida, Anita in Ohio, Michael in West Virginia, Jermaine in Virginia, and Ralph in Indiana. Thank you guys so much for being a part of this with us and believing in us and putting your financial faith behind our work. I couldn't be more grateful. Let me take a look over in the live chat and see if there's any comments or questions I can get back to while we're here. Here's Haji. Constitutions don't enforce themselves. Neither do mortgages, contracts, etc. The idea that you could just, especially even more so, when what the benefit to people with power, from the deep state to politicians to the whole apparatus, every level, top to bottom, local, state, federal, everywhere, the incentive is for them to expand their power. They are always trying to expand their power. So literally, if you're just relying on them to follow rules on the one side of it, if there's no outside enforcement, we should not be surprised that it will keep growing and getting worse. I have been mentioning quite a bit lately Sir Isaac Newton, which Thomas Jefferson considered, along with Sir Francis Bacon and John Locke, as his great trinity of the greatest thinkers who had ever lived. And one thing that I think is starting to hit home to me is the kind of the Newtonian influence, even though he really, this is not a politician, but Newton's one of his laws was basically an object in motion stays in motion until, there's a counterbalancing thing to put a stop to it. And the same thing can be said about government. And that really kind of helps me understand how Jefferson looked at government power, because if government was always going to keep growing, unless there was something outside of that government itself to stop it, it would never stop growing. And the way that people treat government is, in essence, only looking to government to stop itself, finding the right people to be in power. Doesn't matter which person running for office is talking about, they're going to just clean things up and it's going to be them. That's what it's all about, is getting the right person in power. And they're never really discussing the ultimate problem, the root that we face, the root issue that we face, which is too much power in too few hands. Kirk Morrison, great point here. I hope you're doing well. I know Kirk has been really up and down with back issues, and I know how much of a struggle that can be, even though mine is nowhere near probably as bad. So I hope you're doing well, Kirk, and thank you for being here. I think we need a revolution to get back to the Constitution, but it needs to be in thought and forcing more states, rejecting demands from D.C. As John Adams correctly described the American Revolution, he said, the revolution was a radical change in the viewpoints of the people from 1760 through, or 1761, depending on where he wrote it, through 1775, before the shot heard round the world. Because this is what caused the change. As long as people took a different approach, that was the real American Revolution. And I agree with you, Kirk. We absolutely need a real American Revolution again today. We don't necessarily need to go out there and necessarily, that isn't mean a war. The revolution happened, as John Adams put it, before the war commenced. We need a radical change in how people address things, how people view their relationship with government. And it should be disgusting at every single turn. It's not just disgusting when the other team is in power, because your guys aren't going to be running it, or you're not going to run it forever. And eventually the other people will be there as well. Let me take a look. Future episode, try comparing. Oh, this is a tough one. Senator DT, this is a great recommendation, and I got to get on this. Try comparing the 14th Amendment as written to how it is usurped today. 14th Amendment, if you listen to Brian McClanahan's podcast or watch him on YouTube or wherever, Brian talks a lot about the 14th. He's even talked about some of the Section 3 stuff more recently, which everyone seems to be interested in, but a lot on incorporation. And he points out that really the government we have today, this massive centralized state, it really started because of the twisting of the judiciary of the 14th Amendment to make it into something completely different than the founding. And people, well, the experts on the Constitution, when they're talking about how to look at the Constitution, they don't even look at the original document, the debates anymore. It's really just all about the 14th Amendment. So that is a big topic. I've barely covered it in one episode, but I appreciate the recommendation. Let me take a look and see what else. Dixie Strong also says, great suggestion, man. You guys, that's a lot of pressure, but I'll do my best on this one. We've got some content that I can work with as well. And here's Haji. Tucker said taking undelegated authority is a usurpation of power, and a usurpation of power is a treason against the sovereignty of the people. Yes, that's in his view of the Constitution of the United States, which is available for free online over at Liberty Fund. We also sell it with a small profit. I mean, all of our prices for our books are kind of marked up because we don't buy in bulk and we don't do a lot of sales. But basically, every time you make a purchase over at shop.10thamendmentcenter.com, whether it's a t-shirt or a book or a membership, but products, there's not a huge margin there, but all of it goes back into the 10th Amendment Center so we can reach and teach more people about the Constitution and liberty and how to defend both when government refuses to do so, which is 24/7, 365. Don't forget 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I'll take a look over in the, Rights Are Not Tradition is a great screen name as well. I'm going to take a look over in the chat a little bit later again today and tomorrow and see if I can get anything that I can get back to. You can also email me at team@10thamendmentcenter.com. I read pretty much everything. I guess I've been missing a few here and there, but I do my best to read through all of it, and I rarely get a chance to reply to much, but I appreciate all the feedback. It helps me out a great deal. Again, I hope you had a great Thanksgiving. I hope your week is off to a good start. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I hope to see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.